Hey everybody, this is Aaron Harris, host of the Football Odyssey, and today I want to talk to you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free, and there are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone and computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So go and download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming back to the Football Odyssey. This is your host, Aaron Harris. Today I'm speaking with Greg James. Greg is a football historian that runs the CFL America Radio podcast and is the co-host of both From the 55-Yard Line podcast and Gridiron Japan. Greg and I kick back and have a wide-ranging conversation that covers his Canadian football fandom, Howard Cosell, American football in Japan, and much, much more. It was a pleasure to talk to a fellow football-obsessed fan like myself, and I hope you all enjoy this conversation just as much as I did. As always, feel free to subscribe, share, and reach out and let me know what you think. I've also attached the links to Greg's podcast and social handles in the description, so please go on and listen to his shows as well. As always, thank you for listening, and now enjoy the show. I was looking on Twitter today and I saw your new WFL. I don't know if it's your icon on the site or if it was just a poster that you had up there.
Yeah, I started an additional CFL America, which is all my, all the podcast stuff from the 55-yard line, CFL America Radio, football nostalgia. I don't know. I had a little downtime over the weekend and let me do something World Football League because there's nobody out there doing any World Football League nostalgia that I can see on Twitter. So, and I in my moments where I've got some downtime, Pinterest and the phone, it's I call the phone my fidget spinner. So for me, football history is kind of my way of tuning out the real world. And I went in DC over the weekend and did a lot of that. And as I was telling you right before we went on the air, was in the eye of the hurricane over there in DC. So for me, football is kind of a nice break from reality.
Yeah, and it's interesting too how social media for a lot of football history fans, and I guess on a broader spectrum, sports history fans, has become this sort of museum.
Yeah, definitely has. And it's a place where we can all come together. Doesn't really matter which side of the aisle you're on. With football, we're all kind of on the same side. Sports in general, though.
Yeah. I mean, you're doing 3 different podcasts, right? You're doing From the 55-Yard Line, CFL America, and then you had the Japanese football podcast, right?
Yeah, doing the Gridiron Japan podcast. The CFL America Radio one is pretty much just public domain documentaries I find on the internet, kind of push them out there. So, and then Scott and I, we've got From the 55-Yard Line, where we try to talk to authors, people who write about are actually part of history. We had Matt Dunnigan on over the summer with the CFL, and we've had another former CFL player. And hopefully by the time this airs, we will have talked to Jeff Pearlman, who wrote the great book on the USFL.
How did you and Scott come to collaborate on the podcast?
Well, Scott's book came out, and I'd seen him on Twitter, and we were kind of talking to the same people, and in between, responding to each other's tweets and everything, him and I messaged him. I'm like, hey, we should do a podcast together. And we've been buds ever since.
And when the CFL America Radio, was that something that you had been working on for a long time prior to starting From the 55-Yard Line, or were the two kind of close together?
It was right together.
Yeah.
They both kind of, and for me, doing the podcast and doing the CFL America Radio, all kind of happened about the time I retired from the military because I had a lot of extra time and the one thing about the military is, you serve with a close group of guys. And once my service ended after 30 years, well, everybody kind of goes their separate ways. And, with our football community, as I like to call it on social media, it really is. There's really a tightness and a cohesiveness I've found in the last year that's even better than when I had the military in some respects.
Yeah, I think the extent that I see a lot of disagreement either comes with mostly among coaches in terms of who likes to run out of a 22 personnel set as opposed to who likes running out of the power tee, and
Right.
who's having trouble with the double wing and how you should respond to RPOs. It seems like the coaches that sometimes can kind of go at each other, albeit civically, but yeah, I do kind of
Right.
enjoy those little discussions because it's good that with what you call like football Twitter, where you can look at history one day, the old football film Twitter page where they show a lot of like trick plays and old football footage.
Oh,
I think,
yeah.
I think it gives you great variety.
Yeah. And then NFL Classic. I mean, there's just so many, guys out there like you and I just kicking that stuff out. For me, it's instead of Facebook, I do Twitter, pretty much football Twitter now.
So talk to me about your relationship with football, because obviously, having followed you on Twitter and listening to interviews you've done, and then, just in kind of our personal conversations, football seems to have this larger than life appeal to you that it does to me. So can you, I guess, speak to what the game means to you and sort of your relationship with it?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So for me, I was born in 67. So that puts me being, as I tell many people, I was born when Lombardi coached the Packers and Hallis coached the Bears. So you fast forward to 1977, I'm an impressionable 10-year-old who had to wear glasses in the second grade. So I think it was about the third or fourth grade is when I got glasses. They were brown horn-rimmed glasses that looked just like the ones Bob Greasy wore. And from there on, I was hooked. I don't know if it was a magazine article I saw him in, it was on TV. I don't remember, but ever since then, I have been a hardcore football fan. Of course, over the years, it's waned, and depending upon career and life in general. But that's where in '77, and specifically, I can even tell you the game was the game where the Dolphins. It was a Thanksgiving game. It was the Dolphins, who I was a huge fan. I was a 10-year-old kid watching my idol, Bob Greasy, play, and he lit up the Cardinals for 6 touchdown passes in a game. Now, mind you, that was on Thanksgiving Day. There was a couple of years where the Cardinals were the home team for Thanksgiving. And so that's where it started. And but I didn't see my first NFL game until I think my second year of graduate school.
What was it?
That was a Colts Dolphins game in Indianapolis. I think it had to been 1990. So
now, do you still follow the Dolphins? I mean, did that fandom stick with you?
No. After Greasy retired, after Zonka retired, because Zonka came back with the Dolphins in '79. So I was too young to, fall in love with the '72 Dolphins. But Zonka came back in '79, so at least I got to say I could say to myself, "Hey, I got to see Zonka play." And but after Greasy retired, after Zonka retired, that's where I drifted back to the Bears, who are my hometown team. And then about 91, I was in Phoenix. I was kind of, I was young. I think it was about 25, 26, about ready to go and do Army basic training. And, just kind of, I latched onto the Cardinals. And I think part of the reason why I latched onto them was at the time, and even still now to a certain point, they are the one team that's constantly disrespected, at least by fandom. Now, back then, I mean, nobody was rooting for the Cardinals. They had just moved from St. Louis. So, and there was also something too about that original Cardinal logo that I love and still love.
Who was the player that whenever they moved to Phoenix, they upset the Vikings? I don't know if they had won a game that year, but he caught like a touchdown on the sideline, I think at the very end of the game. And
I don't remember the receiver who just off the top of my head. I don't remember the receiver who caught the ball. I remember the quarterback who threw the ball, and that was Josh McCown.
Okay.
Threw it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was because I think it was the Packers needed the Vikings to lose that game to get into the playoffs,
Right.
and the Vikings were on fire that year and they blew it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And after that game, the receiver, they paid his way up to Green Bay for the playoff game.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And if I remember the news report correctly, he was dressed in Cardinal gear. So everybody knew who he was. And he was the celebrity for the day up there.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, he certainly played a big part in it. Now, what about the CFL fandom with you? When did that kind of come into the picture, and how did the game appeal to you in ways that American football didn't?
Okay. So where I learned about Canadian football was in the library. Right now, back, growing up when I was in school back in the 80s, I mean, we didn't have obviously internet. All we had was the library, and all you could do was really read about the game. I mean, there was nothing to see on TV. The CFL came on briefly in the States when I was a kid during that strike, but the ratings were so bad. And I'll be honest with you, I don't remember watching any of those games. I couldn't even tell you what I was up to. I was in high school. But as I got older and I started getting exposure to it, at least on ESPN, when I watch a game, I'm like, this is a pretty cool game. And just reading about a lot of the heroes up there, just kind of gravitated towards it because it is in many ways a very much an underdog league, as we all know now, with everything that's happened with the pandemic. And there's something about Canadian football, its relation to the fans, the relationship to its communities that we just don't get here, and that we used to have here in the States, but we don't have now. And guys that play in the CFL are pretty much working Joes.
So, in the same way that like Bob Greasy got you into the NFL, who were like some of the players that got you into the CFL when you started watching?
When I started watching and learning about, the great players, would be the one person who I can tell you off the top of my head, who I did not see play, but who I'd heard stories and seen highlights, once YouTube started coming around, was Matt Dunnigan. And we did an interview on our show From the 55 with Matt Dunnigan, and it was an awesome 2 hours. That's about the only way to describe it. And there have been other players along the way, but in terms of just one specific player that I loved watching, not really one in particular, just pretty much the style of play and learning for me, part of it too is learning the history of Canada through sport. And that's always been an enjoyable part for me of any type of thing I get involved in, whether it be on the military side. When I was an intel officer, learning about, various militaries I was involved with around the world, learning about the history, the background. So for me, that's where my love of the CFL grew, was learning not just about the players who played, but also, learning about the culture itself. And, there's a lot that Canada has to offer that we don't have, I should say, let me take that back. There's a lot of things about Canada we as Americans can learn and how to be true fans. Because sometimes I think it's down here in the States, we're kind of like, we forget about the history of the game.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a certain detachment among fan bases, no doubt. I mean, even if you read kind of books like Three Bricks Shy of a Load or The Forgettables, you'll see like that
Right.
sort of the average Joe and being out at the local bar after the game, and you get people there who will talk to them. I mean, when I was in Atlanta, I was at a barbecue, and there was a guy who, when he was in college, worked up in Wisconsin as a bartender, and Brett Favre came to Lambeau that weekend for the first time coming back. And him and the offensive lineman and a few other people on the team bought the bar out for the night so they didn't have anybody come in, which I guess in certain regards I can understand, being that it was Favre going back to Lambeau. But I think that does kind of highlight how the game has gotten so big and so corporatized that it's hard to really identify too much with people that play.
Right. And, for me growing up, I mean, always heard the stories about the Baltimore Colts. Mm-hmm. And, I've always, Baltimore obviously is the only town that has won a CFL, NFL, and USFL championship. And you hear the stories about what I told this to my wife the other day. She was asking, is there any place you would really want to travel to? Because we've been doing a lot of traveling lately. I go, well, 1960s Baltimore is really about the one place where I would love to go to, but we can't go back there anymore because of the Colts, because of the time and place, because of the relationship of the team to its fans. And like you said about Brett Favre, buying out a bar and kind of closing. No, I mean, back then, hey, Johnny Unitas and all the players drank with the fans. And so that's the other, and getting back to what we were talking about with why I love the CFL, there's still that relationship that CFL players have with the fans up there.
Yeah, well, I think to your point too about looking at or using a sport to kind of learn also about a nation, a culture, and history in and of itself. Whenever I was doing the episode about football in Japan, or I guess even earlier than that, when I wrote the article for the website, I learned a lot about World War II and about the country before the war, and about the occupation more than I had ever learned through school or just personal interest, anything like that. So it is I think sports in and of itself, or whatever you're interested in, is a great way to sort of go beyond just learning about that topic and learning about the surrounding history that it revolves around.
Right. No, you're exactly right. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Japanese baseball, and within the next year or two, my wife and I are going to be moving back to Japan. And for me, football, American Gridiron football in Japan, baseball in Japan, those are going to be my conduits to understanding better the culture that I'm in.
Yeah. Now, did your CFL fandom kind of coincide with your passion for the CFL game itself? Because for me personally, I was into the NFL before I really got deep involved in like the actual game itself, if that makes sense, like learning about the evolution of the rule books and the strategy. So would you say the two were kind of coincided with each other?
Yeah, definitely. They coincided. I mean, you spend enough time in a library as a kid, you can only read the encyclopedia articles so many times on Canadian football until, I mean, even now up until this season, I really didn't have a favorite team. And at one point I just decided, hey, the BC Lions are my team. And it had something to do with, of all the teams that are out there, I joke with Reed Johnson over at the Markcast. I go, well, they're not America's team, but they're British America's team. So ever since then, I've, been rooting hard for the Lions, but much like being a Detroit Lions fan, being a BC Lions fan seems to be much like an Arizona Cardinal fan. Expect disappointment, but hope for the best.
What would you say is the good starting point for someone who wants to learn about Canadian football history?
You know what? I would say the Grey Cup, because the Grey Cup is the one game where, not going to pull any punches. The attendance at CFL games is not like what it is here in the States with the NFL. It's much akin to, kind of being in a White Sox game where it's mostly empty seats often. But the Grey Cup, if you're looking for the introduction to what the sport is, to what the Canadian football is all about, and also what it means to Canada, that would be the Grey Cup.
What about going back to like even Harvard, McGill? Would you look at that as like a sort of early point for people to kind of look at? Because I thought it was interesting how the two histories coincided and then kind of split apart for a little while, because I can't speak for the CFL too much, but it's like that game kind of broke American football off from rugby because of the snapback, and they by therefore the line of scrimmage. So I'm curious, like if there's a history there with when Canadian football actually began a distinct identity from rugby union.
Oh yeah. And you look at the history of, and even though the CFL technically has only been a league for 60 some years. I mean, the teams themselves go back well over 100 years in some cases. And and I've learned that, especially in this last year with the pandemic, spending a lot of time reading up on Canadian football history, there's just so much history there that fans in general, and probably even Canadians, don't know in terms of the players. Deep history of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. You look at the Edmonton team, and you look at Toronto, and even BC. BC's not the youngest. Well, they are not. They're no longer the youngest team. The Red Blacks are the youngest team, but in each city there is a distinct football culture and a distinct set of heroes that when I talk to CFL fans, I will get lost with names. It's like, I've never heard that name before. And so when I'm Howie Mooney and I had a long conversation about a month ago on our podcast, and he just throwing all these names at me, and I'm writing them down. It's like, I did not know about these people. Did not know about these players. And Winnipeg, you've got some great players, some great teams up there that listening to the stories, you're like, and also looking back and kind of comparing the talent in a historical perspective, some of these teams, I would venture to guess, could have beat some of the best NFL teams back, say, in the 30s and the 40s, just based upon the talent. The talent was a lot more equitable, I guess, but way back when, prior to, say, 1960.
And now these teams, before it actually became the CFL, were they just local club teams that would have to, make their own schedules, or were there different leagues at the time that kind of consolidated into the CFL?
Well, you had the Western provinces, and you had the Eastern provinces, and so for a while you had both sets of the country. There really wasn't an interlocking schedule. I mean, where a lot of the teams met up, you started having, a nationwide, equivalent of the Super Bowl was the Grey Cup, and but it was in the 1940s, and that's when the Grey Cup started becoming more of a truly national event than what it was before. But a lot of those teams that you're looking at, Winnipeg, Toronto is the oldest professional football team in North America, and the Hamilton Tiger Cats obviously fans of the Hamilton Tiger Cats would probably argue hard about that. But in Hamilton, there were two different teams that merged. So, I mean, the history of the teams in each of these towns, including, like, say, the Red Blacks, goes back, basically a century.
When you mentioned that there was that some of the teams actually could have even beaten the NFL, wasn't there actually a game between Buffalo and a CFL team?
There was a series of games in the 1950s and right through the early 1960s where the NFL and CFL teams squared off. And you had the Bears, for instance, playing the Alouettes. You had the Chicago Cardinals playing and also the St. Louis Cardinals playing the Argonauts. You had the Giants. I think the Giants played the Rough Riders off the top of my head. And I know you had Buffalo playing the Hamilton Ticats, who are right across. Obviously, Buffalo and Hamilton are two cities that are very close. And that was the one, and the NFL won all of those meetings with the CFL. The only American loss was when the Ticats beat the Buffalo Bills, who were obviously part of the AFL at the time.
Now, was this like the first half is played under American football rules, second half played under CFL rules, or was it one game?
Yeah, they mixed it up.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see how some of the American players would have done with the forward motions and the multiple men in motion. I'm not sure if they had those rules at the time.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know that's the frustrating thing about that period in time. Other than what we have in the newspaper articles, there's very little footage of really what happened of any of those games.
Yeah, there are some good YouTube channels that have old newsreels, or maybe I shouldn't say newsreels. I mean, they kind of look like a highlight film,
right?
But just cut down to like the plays throughout the game. I mean, I've seen some from like the 1940-41 championship game with the Giants and the Bears. So I have seen some interesting highlight footage from football back at the time, but I don't know if I would find from like that was an exhibition games.
Yeah, and there is. I know. I've seen it out there. The CBC did a 2-minute thing on that series of games, and there was some footage in there, but not enough that you could kind of get a feel of what the game was actually like.
Yeah, I'm sure NFL Films must have it somewhere. It's deep in the vault.
Oh yeah, you would hope, but even back then, I mean, that was before NFL Films existed. So who knows? It could be. The great thing about YouTube is you and I have discovered over the years is, when people've got footage of stuff that's buried in their attics, and oftentimes it's discovered by a much younger relative, and the next thing you know, it's uploaded. I mean, there's a holy grail of games out there. I know amongst my Canadian friends who are like, oh, if I could only get this game. I mean, there's other games out there that are on YouTube, but every now and then you find a good one. A good example is, for me, in terms of the holy grail of football games, is the Earl Campbell Monday Night Football game with the Miami Dolphins.
So
which
his jersey's getting ripped off? Is that it?
Yeah, that's that was classic Howard Cosell. That's when Monday Night Football meant something, and that of all the games was, if you got to pick a game that represented what Monday Night Football was in the 70s, it would be that game.
Yeah, I didn't realize it until now, but I think one of the common themes that I get from guest to guest, not every week, but typically conversations revolving around football history, is just about how Monday Night Football used to be larger than life.
It was, and a lot of that had to do with Howard Cosell. And I don't know how much you've read on Howard Cosell or even seen of Howard Cosell, but back in the 70s, everybody knew who Cosell was. I mean, he was irritating, but you loved listening to him. It was a love-hate relationship with a lot of fans. But I know as a kid, hey, when Monday Night Football came on and Howard Cosell was on, it was a big event. But back in those days, we had 4 channels.
Yeah.
So we didn't have a whole lot of choices.
Well, and plus what people also say too is that was the first time where you could see highlights from other games.
Right. And the great thing about when Cosell did those highlights, he did them all ad lib.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And watching that stuff, and I'm much like Rich Eisen. I don't know if you ever I don't know how much you watch Rich Eisen or listen to him.
Sure.
But Rich Eisen's very much a Howard Cosell fan. Like me, and to listen to him back in those games is, to me, as irritating as his voice can be to many. For me, it's like listening to John Facenda. I can't get enough of that voice talking about football. I don't know what it is.
That's interesting. That's an interesting comparison. I'm not sure there's a lot of people that would have made that too.
Well, I know there's a guy who by the name of Matt North. Now I love my music too, and I love discovering new music. And there's a song out there by this guy by the name of Matt North. I was just sitting one day at work, just kind of, needed some new music. And I was looking for something. And I think I typed in the word Cosell into Amazon Music, of all things. I think I was looking for something football related. This great song came up called Cronkite and Cosell. And Matt North, who's a singer-songwriter, talks about that time period I grew up in, where Walter Cronkite was your most trusted source of news, and Howard Cosell. When Howard Cosell came on, you listened, and it's a great song that kind of evokes kind of that time period back in the 70s, where that's kind of most of us how we got either our news or our sports news.
Yeah, Cosell, I haven't done a real deep dive on. I mean, there are some funny stories that I've heard just from reading different books about him, little snippets here and there. I think there is a biography that was written about him in the 90s. I'm not sure if the author...
I've got several of his books, and
if
you're looking at anybody's listening here who's interested, type in the greatest Cosell story ever told on YouTube, and it's a story that Billy Crystal tells.
Oh yeah,
it's just an awesome story.
Yeah, I'll look it up and post the link in the description. But from what I understand, he kind of had a falling from grace from the sports broadcasting, or I guess sports as a whole, didn't he? Like, I'm not really sure what happened.
Yeah, he became a bitter man at the end. You hear people talk about him now, and his wife passed away. Oh. He was just bitter at the end towards people he worked with. He was a bit of a fragile ego,
which I think a lot of the people who have the loudest voice are usually.
Right. But he was he was great at what he did. But, he was also he also did USFL games too. And he was involved. He's the reason why he was Doug Flutie's agent and negotiated with Trump to land the deal he did for Flutie. So, respected, but at the end, he pissed off, for pardon my language, but he pissed off a lot of people he worked with because he pretty much threw them all under the bus in his final book.
That kind of adds to his own mythology, though.
Yeah.
So whenever we spoke last week about Matt Dunnigan, and you said that he was the CFL's equivalent of Terry Bradshaw, that kind of made me curious about some other CFL equivalents to NFL legends. And I have a few here that if you could kind of connect the dots between these NFL legends and their CFL counterparts, I'd be kind of curious to see what you could come up with. And there's only about 6 of them, but the first one I had was Deacon Jones.
Angela Mosca.
Why?
Just that reputation for toughness.
What did he kind of change the rules to in terms of like head slaps or physicality?
I don't know if he changed the rules at all, but I know in talking about defensive players over the years in the CFL, Angela Mosca, to me, has that legendary status as Deacon Jones. Kind of like Deacon Jones, Dick Butkus, all combined in one.
That's a frightening picture to imagine.
Yeah.
Now, what about Randy White?
Randy White, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't got an equivalent for you off the top of my head.
Would Mean Joe Green be a better?
Could be with Angela Mosca. Yeah, it could be. I really don't know.
What about Larry Wilson?
Oh, another one I don't know.
Johnny Unitas.
Johnny Unitas. Now, see, they're with the quarterbacks, especially in the CFL, because it's such a pass-oriented game.
Sure.
You got Russ Jackson, Ron Lancaster. When you talk about CFL quarterbacks, those are the two that come to mind right off. During that 60s and 70s era.
For them, was it an instance where they kind of pioneered like what the game was turning into, or kind of foreshadowed in that same sense?
Yeah, I think foreshadowed, and also too, I mean, they were, to use a John Mellencamp quote, they were big legends in little towns. Ron Lancaster, he played, when you talk about, to anybody that I talk to on the Canadian side about the greatest quarterbacks in CFL history, those two are right at the top of the list, along with Warren Moon. And then, now we've got Bo Levi Mitchell, Mike Riley and those guys that are playing now. But, and talking about CFL history, you can't talk about CFL history without talking about Lancaster, or Jackson, just their impact on the game.
Wasn't there also a Harold Grange back in the early CFL days as well?
Oh boy, I don't know.
I remember catching 5 minutes of a CFL documentary, and they talked about the other Red Grange.
I don't know. I'd have to look that up. So that's funny because it's you and I. I grew up on American football history, and so now learning as much as I can about the Canadian side, even though because we really didn't even have too much access. When you go to American Library, you're not looking, to get books on Canadian football. Still a hard get. And there's not, you've got a ton of books on American football history, but there's just a small selection of Canadian football history books too. The internet obviously has changed things, but so I'm still learning.
What would you say thus far that you've read is the quintessential Canadian football book?
Anything by Frank Cosentino. He wrote a great book called The Passing Game, which, and he's, that book just kind of covers Canadian football from its beginnings to about the mid 70s when, the World Football League was coming in or threatening to come into Canada. And the Canadian Parliament was threatening to basically pass a legislation to keep American football teams out of Canada. Let me see here. And Paul Woods has written 2 great books. He's written a book on the 91 Argos and the early 80s Argos who won the Grey Cup. And I have not read the 91 book yet. And everybody I've talked to said, you got to read it. It's just awesome. But he's pretty much, when it comes to football historians, him, Frank Cosentino, and there's a few others, and I just don't remember them off the top of my head. I've got all their books up in my reading room.
I think The Passing Game might be on my reading list. I mean,
yeah.
that's more of it does document the game, but it's also very much about the boardroom battles and the CFL.
Right.
Yeah, I because
Right.
after I read The League by David Harris, which is predominantly about the boardroom battles within the NFL during Rozell's
Right.
era, I was really interested in finding another book that was like that because, I never really seen a book that went that deep into the business side of the NFL and ownership battles. And that was actually something that came up, and I never have gotten the book yet. But, now that you mention it, it kind of reminds me of my interest in reading that one.
And there's another one, End Zones and Border Wars.
That's about the
About
American expansion, right?
Yes, yeah. And to me, when during that whole XFL, CFL speculation, that was the one book that I kept referencing to people, especially on the American side, because the people, those who, CFL fans already went through one American expansion, and it didn't go well. And so and that was, trying to explain to Americans down here, kind of what the CFL is all about, and just don't, I was defending the CFL side, saying, "Listen, just because it's American doesn't mean it's better." I'm like, "Well, here, read this book," and it's surprising that the one thing about history is, in order to learn from history, you got to read about history, and that's where the lessons of that American, when they came down here, they brought the Canadian game down to the States. There's some great lessons learned.
Whenever I was writing the article for my website about the history of pro football in Las Vegas before the Raiders, I did a little research on the Las Vegas posse.
Yeah.
And it just sounded like that was a shit show from the get-go. I mean, they were practicing in a parking lot right next to the Tropicana Hotel and Casino.
Oh yeah. And then actually the book's got some great stories about Ron Meyer.
That was the coach.
He was the head
right?
coach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Apparently, didn't the quarterback for that team actually go on to break passing records in the CFL?
Anthony Calvillo.
Yeah.
He's another one of those guys on the Mount Rushmore of great quarterbacks in the CFL that, as we were talking just a little bit ago.
Wow.
I completely did completely had I blanked out on.
Yeah, it was funny. I mean, when I was watching the broadcast and there was talk about them moving to Sacramento or maybe like another location, I don't remember where,
right.
But you had the broadcasters that said players say they played in front of more people in high school than they have for this game.
Well, and the thing with the Canadian experiment down here was, and this is, as we're kind of moving along, and there's always this talk about the next spring league, is the marketing research, whether it's going to sell or not. It was clear when the CFL came to the States that nobody had researched anything. And the fact that, and just by sheer luck, the team of Baltimore was, for all practical purposes, a success, a moderate, minor success, but a success. It was, the reason why that happened was because of a confluence of the players' strike, Baltimore getting turned down for an NFL expansion. So the, fans of Baltimore had nothing really to watch. Stallions show up, they just got turned down by the NFL. So, but it's hard to capture lightning in a bottle twice.
Yeah, I haven't gone too deeply into the Stallions lore, but it does seem to me that if it was any other city where they had the success, it probably wouldn't have done that well, just because I think the relationship that the city of Baltimore had with the NFL at that time, they were willing just to support anything but the NFL. Right.
Well, and the other part of that too was that team did have the blessing of the old Colts too. Yeah, Johnny Unitas, Tom Matte, he was part of that group. They had the blessing of the old Colts, but and the frustrating part is there's still a segment out there, and it's even still happens in Canada where they see Canadian football as inferior product to what's put out, to what we play down here in the States.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up because when I was living in Atlanta, I was at a beer festival, and there was a guy that was from Canada who, I don't know if he had moved to the US or if he was just down in Atlanta doing a construction gig. And I asked him, like, do you go to any Canadian football games? Because he was talking about hockey. And he said, yeah, I've been to a few, but most people prefer the NFL just because it's a better product. I'm kind of curious. I mean, based off your, your research and your conversation, is that the sentiment that most people would give you?
Yeah. Yeah, really? Pretty much. I mean, your CFL fans are hardcore who have been fans since they were kids. But the problem with the CFL fandom is we're kind of, it's aging out. I mean, I play simulation football. We've got the same issue in our sim leagues. All the guys in my sim leagues are in their 60s and 70s. And for somebody like me, it's in his mid-50s. I'm kind of the young guy of the bunch. So the
Really?
problem with the CFL, yeah. So the problem with the CFL is it's kind of the same thing. They're just not attracting the new fans, like, the way they attracted young fans back in, say, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah, that almost seems similar to the problem that baseball has right now in America.
Oh, yeah. 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 And, baseball is another good example. I mean, people, I don't think really recognize it. I mean, I've seen, you don't see it here in Chicago if you go to a Cubs game. You see, I mean, it's the Cubs, there's something about, but you go on the South Side to a Sox game and you see that fact. You see that baseball is kind of losing fans. I mean, it's not cheap, obviously, to go to games anymore, but and that's the other problem with the CFL. I mean, in many ways, they're pricing the average fan out of stuff. I mean, the NFL has priced us all out anyway.
Yeah.
We're hearing that argument. The Bears are talking about building a new stadium up in Arlington Heights, and when that thing does get built, guys like you and I, it's going to be, we're going to have to budget out for just one game.
Oh, certainly. As far as the relationship between the NFL and the CFL, at what point in the CFL's history do you think that it became this sort of, quote unquote, unofficial development league for the NFL? Like
Probably
at the point where you had a lot of guys that were, kind of taxi squad guys going up there to get more experience. When do you think that really started kind of fermenting?
I think that really started happening after, I would say, probably about the 90s. I mean, it was happening even before then, but I mean, when the money really started to take off in the States with football, the CFL kind of got left in the dust in terms of revenue stream. So I don't really specific, but it's been within the last, say, 30 years, because there was a time where guys would not go to Joe Theismann, a good example. He was drafted by the Dolphins back during the Bob Griese era. He was supposed to be the heir apparent to Bob Griese. Argonauts offered him more money. He went north.
Yeah, there was a Pro Football Researchers Association article I read a couple of years ago. It was an older article, but it was talking about the bidding war in the 1950s between the CFL and the NFL. And I had never given it much consideration because I just kind of figured that back in those days, there was probably a little crossover, but for the most part, it didn't really lead to any all-out bidding war. And obviously it was never as big as the AFL, NFL, but I thought it was an interesting piece of history that I never really considered.
Yeah. Well, and back then too, you didn't have TV money. It's when the TV money really started to take off is where you saw things kind of like starting to separate, because the CFL, they've got a TV contract, but their TV contract with TSN is, it's $5 million per team. So, okay. So you divide that by, times that by, that's still less than what many players make on teams.
Yeah.
So you got 45 million TV contract. Well, hell, you're playing your star players like, double that.
Yeah. I don't know if I have this right, but didn't one of the sponsors pull out? I don't know if it was a TV sponsor. I think one of the beer companies up in Canada pull out, and that's when they had to kind of expand in America to rely on the expansion fees.
Right. Yeah. I think it was Carling O'Keefe that pulled out.
Yeah.
And that's where, going back to talking about Paul Woods, Paul Woods makes the argument that John Candy is the one who ultimately saved the CFL.
John Candy.
So back in the 90s, when he was part of that ownership group, he was the one that was he was advocating for American expansion. And he started the American, an expansion committee. Now, obviously he passed away, right after his ownership in the Argonauts, but he was the one that pushed that. And I know Paul and I, and Arshan, when we were talking about Paul's first book, kind of makes that argument, and it's a valid argument that without John Candy, because I mean, again, the CFL has always been money, I don't want to say money deficient. I mean, they're really operating on a shoestring. And there was a point right after the American expansion stuff ended that there was a real question where they were going to make it to the next season, because I mean, they were literally operating on a shoestring.
Now they're a single entity ownership, right? There's no individual owners that own franchises.
No, that's the problem. There's 9 individual owners. I think that has, because if you had a single entity, I think the CFL would be in much better financial shape.
Has it
But
always
instead,
been that? Has it always been that way?
yeah,
That structure? Okay.
yeah, it's always been that way. Always been that way. So in the CFL, you have 6 teams that are owned either by groups or individuals, and then 3 other teams that are owned by the communities that they're in. So you've got Winnipeg, Edmonton, and the Rough Riders. They're owned by the community. And then you've got 6 other teams that had individual owners, whether they be just one person, say out in British Columbia,
Gotcha.
or in Toronto, where you've got MLSE that owns not just the Argonauts, but the Raptors, the Maple Leafs, the soccer team out there. So you got 9 different owners, and that does make, much like the NFL. In the NFL, when it comes to the ownership and the relationship, the owners and the commissioner, in the NFL, there's a strong commissioner. You don't really have a strong commissioner in the CFL, at least in my opinion.
Does the CFL have an equivalent to Pete Rozelle?
No, I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so. You look at the number of commissioners they've had. I mean, Pete Rozelle.
Maybe that's not fair for me to ask, because Rozelle is really a generational commissioner.
Right. No, but they haven't had a generational. They haven't had a generational commissioner. If they did, I think you wouldn't have the CFL having the issues that it does. I mean, Randy Ambrosie's a nice guy. We all know he is, but he just doesn't have the ability to wield the authority that Pete Rozelle was handed back in 1960 by George Halas and the old school owners to, compete with the AFL. And that's a reason I think why Pete Rozelle had so much power, was because of the threat of the AFL.
Yeah, certainly. So with that said, would you say that there was ever what people would consider a golden age of the CFL?
I think in talking with a lot of my friends, especially those my age, I would say the 60s and the 70s, because back then you had full stadiums. And then, once the 80s, it was the 80s that began that long, slow decline to kind of where we're at now, where you occasionally you'll have a full stadium somewhere, but when you watch a game, oftentimes there's more empty seats than there are people in the stands. Edmonton being a classic example of that, and same with Toronto. And these are towns, especially Toronto. Toronto is one of the founding members, is the oldest pro football team on the continent, but yet, they struggle to fill a stadium and put even 10,000 people in it.
Now, where does Canadian football kind of fit in the pop culture conversation? Because obviously hockey dominates up there, and I'm not really sure what else would constitute pop culture in Canada. But if you go to a bar up in Canada, not that you live there, but do you often find that you could find people having a conversation about CFL games that are being played that weekend, or where does it kind of really fit into the bigger picture of their culture?
And I think, and if I'm wrong, I hope somebody corrects me on it, but in talking to people, following the Canadian news. So back in the States, for the longest time, you had football is number 1, baseball is number 2, basketball is number 3, and NHL is number 4. Well, that whole order has been, NFL is still number 1. NBA and NHL probably competing for that number 2 slot, and baseball is at number 4. The CFL is probably the number 4 sport up there, because hockey is always going to be number 1.
Sure.
Well, you've got the Toronto Raptors. They're Canada's team, and baseball would probably be but then you've got soccer. So you've got 5 major sports now. And I apologize, I should have mentioned MLS, but MLS is number 5 here in terms of popularity among spectator sports. But MLS is much more popular than, at least getting people in the stands, than say the CFL. on the flip side, when it comes to TV ratings, the CFL is still a popular sport.
Well, I think even if we're talking about what we mentioned earlier about people enjoying the NFL as a product, I mean, could you even argue that that number 5 spot would probably, or that number 4 spot would be a tie between MLS soccer and NFL before Canadian football?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Does what about like Canadian college football? Is that a thing at all up there?
Well, it is. The problem is you can't find it on TV. And even Canadians will tell you, I'd love to watch it, but where can I find it? I mean, they play it, and there's a lot of talent that's up there, but it's just visibility.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it seems like probably streaming is the only way that you would find it.
Right. But even then, just even trying to find, as they call it up there, U Sports is hard. I mean, it's kind of like with the Japanese X League. Until YouTube came along, nobody knew that there was football in Japan.
That's a good segue to your history with Japanese football and your time in Japan, because you lived over there for quite a while. Yeah.
No, I didn't. I met my wife over there. I was on a trip. This was 27 years ago. So that's how I met my wife.
Okay.
And, I've always known they played X League football over there. But again, it's one of those things where, it's being Japanese, there's not a whole lot in English being written about it.
Mm-hmm. Now,
as the internet,
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead and finish.
Oh, but as the internet has evolved, X League and Japanese college football is on YouTube, and the browser software has evolved to the point where, you can just hit the translate button and kind of get a gist of what's going on over there.
When did you first find out that they did play American football in Japan?
Oh God, I couldn't probably right about the time I got married.
Okay.
But this is going way back. Yeah.
Have you been to a game?
No, never been to a game. Watched a lot of games on YouTube and, but never been to a game, but more where my wife is from. It's not really near anywhere, I want to say, readily accessible.
Okay.
So any game I would go to over there would be at least maybe a 1 or 2 hour train ride.
Oh, really? Okay. Hey, you and I are in the same boat in terms of really being exposed to the sport from YouTube. And really, I didn't really give it much consideration. But the way I found out about it was I had gotten a book from my parents for Christmas called Touchdown: An American Obsession. And it's essentially like a collection of academic papers published about football.
Really?
Yeah. And they had an international section that talked about various different countries that had American football, whether it was Germany, Latin America, China even. And they had one about football in Japan. And that by far was the most, in-depth research that went into that portion of the book. And ever since then, I went on YouTube and started looking at footage of them playing, and it was incredible, especially to find a lot of the games from, even the late 70s. I mean, because most of the games I'd actually be willing to say I've seen are probably from the mid 80s until probably the mid 90s.
Yeah.
And then go ahead.
Oh, and over there, it's a club sport. I mean, it's the CFL, we're talking the rankings, like with CFL, the CFL saying being number 5. Man, American football is like number 46 down in Japan.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a following and,
but it's a passionate following.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's what I love about watching it, because number one, most of the players are all amateurs, even though, the X League is not a professional football. I mean, there are guys on the team who are paid, and those are the guys that come over from overseas that are paid to play on the teams. But in general, all those players, they're playing for free. They're playing for the love of the game.
Sure. I think I remember seeing this on Twitter sometime back about the current dynamic, the playing dynamic, how they play for their companies and their employers is sort of similar to how it was in the early NFL era in like the 1920s.
Yeah. And even then, right now, I mean, a lot of the company teams are going away. There's only a couple company sponsor teams over in Japan. I mean, you do a lot of the guys that I think Panasonic and Fujitsu are still the purely company teams, whereas a lot of the other teams that are still club. Yeah, I don't know if I don't think IBM is a complete company team anymore. I mean, they've got sponsorship, but a lot of these guys come in, even though say for example, IBM is on the helmet, the guys that are playing don't necessarily work for IBM.
Gotcha. When do you think for a while, college football was really a much better product than the X League was? When do you think the transition really began between the power structure going from college to the X League?
Oh God, I mean that'd be a good question to field to John Gunning with the Japan Times, who's part of our podcast team. But in just kind of and speaking with him, it's been within the last, say, 20 years.
Yeah.
There's been a disparity of talent. So just recently, up until this, I think it was this past year, the final culmination Japanese football championship was played between the X League champion and the college champion. So we'll just use the American equivalent. Okay. So let's put the Buccaneers against who won the college championship last year? I can't even remember. It's
Bama.
What was it? Bama? That's what I thought. So imagine the Buccaneers and Alabama going against each other. I mean, yes. I mean, well, there would be those who probably would advocate saying Alabama's a bit of a pro team anyway, but
they're still not going to compare. Yeah.
Right. They're not going to compare. So they stopped. So after this, so the X League champion now is, you've got two separate champions. You've got the pro championship or the X League championship and the college championship. The teams are not meeting anymore for the ultimate championship because it got to the point where somebody was going to get hurt on the college level. Sure. Because even if you watch in the last championship, it's like when Notre Dame plays Navy.
Mm-hmm. And
having been to a couple of those games and been on close to the field during warmups, you can see the size difference. It's like, ooh, and no wonder why Navy, loses often by, 30 points, because there's such a size difference and just so just get that to answer that question. Yeah, that's so in the last 20 years, I'd say.
Yeah, the former coach for the KG Fighters, Hideaki Toriuchi. I mean, he's like the winningest coach in Japanese football history. I think he has 12 national championships. And he was talking about, how do you see the sport kind of evolving moving forward after your retirement? He just says, I don't think they're going to be playing with the pros anymore or against the pros in championship games because the disparity has gotten so big.
Yeah, I mean, you watch the game. I mean, you watch the game and it's like, yeah, somebody's going to get hurt.
Yeah, certainly.
And especially, I think it was against Fujitsu the last game. And the Fujitsu guys were huge compared to the guys that played, on the college side.
Do you notice a distinct style of play when you watch these Japanese football games?
Yeah, it's a bit of it's very much, I want to say, compared to the way the game was played in the 80s here. It's very balanced.
A lot of run, a lot of power.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. It's very, it's not necessarily one style, but it's a mixture of both. And, over there, I've seen them still use fullbacks.
Yeah. It's interesting how you mentioned today kind of looks like the 80s, but when you look at the games that we were talking about earlier from the mid 80s to the mid 90s, it almost feels like football circa, I guess in some ways it was more contemporary, like as what we have now, but it was also retro, like 1930s, because it looks like they're using like the short punt offense where they have a guy that's like, 7 yards back. And for those who don't know what I'm talking about, imagine a punt formation, but without a punter, you have a quarterback instead, rather. And he's 7 yards deep instead of the conventional 10 or 11 yards for a punter. But yeah, I mean, they take the snap and they drop back easily 15 yards before they throw the ball. And it's funny to watch, but that's what makes it unique. I mean, I like the fact that you can watch football in a different country and see the way they suit it to their own body types and their strengths, you could say.
The great thing about watching football, American football in Japan, same way with watching baseball is, even though it's they're both American sports by birth.
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese have taken the sport and and not so much made it their own, but put their own spin on it, that I like to celebrate the difference. It's like, you know what? I like the fact that the Japanese are running the ball, have a fullback out there, much like in Japanese baseball, they still bunt the ball.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's if you've ever seen the movie Mr. Baseball with
No.
Tom Selleck, if you're
Mhm.
looking for a good introduction, pretty much into the mindset of Japanese when it comes to sport, using baseball as the analogy with Tom Selleck, it's perfect. I know John Gunning, when he is, when people have come over to Japan and he's recommended, hey, watch Mr. Baseball to get an idea of what it's like in Japan for an athlete coming over from the States.
Okay. Yeah, I gotta check that out then. It's just what you were talking about, how you celebrate the difference. I think that's especially what would be strong for football, right? I mean, we can kind of go with this with the like talking about spring leagues too, where I don't want a carbon copy of the NFL, right? Like,
Right.
give me something different. You know, I know people want
Yeah.
to chalk it up as gimmicky football, but like that's what I want.
Right. And it's,
Anything,
you know what? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
For me, the only thing like I think that needs to be consistent when we're talking about like kind of creating off-brand football is that, you know, the ball can't be projected forward once it's past the line of scrimmage, right? Like you can't like catch a forward pass and then 20 yards downfield and then throw it, kick it,
Right.
butt it, whatever. You know, it's like once the ball crosses the line of scrimmage, that's it. But you know, I would welcome a league where anybody could catch the ball behind the line of scrimmage, or you could have multiple forward passes behind the line of scrimmage. And that's what the XFL had done whenever they came back in vogue in the what was it, 2020 incarnation, 2019?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I missed that entire 2020 season just because I had, in 5 weeks, I think at 3 or 4 of those weeks, I had military duty, so I wasn't able to watch any of the games. And I know I give the XFL guys a hard time, but I love their passion and, you know, their commitment. They want something different, which is why I love the CFL. It is something different. But when it boils down to it, football is still football, no matter if it's a 3-down variety. And we haven't even talked about the indoor game with the Arena League. 6-man football, another good example.
Oh, it's amazing.
It's amazing. So to me, I'm very much, I don't care how many guys are on the field, but as long as the ball stays relatively the same shape, I'm going to love it either way. And, Canadian football is unique in the fact that it had such a separate trajectory in terms of how it evolved, but yet you watch it as an American and you still recognize, even though, the 3 downs is hard for some people to get used to, but once you've kind of got used to that, you forget you're watching a different form of football. At least that's my experience.
Yeah, they didn't institute the forward pass in Canadian football until like the 1920s, right?
I think so. Yeah.
It's pretty late.
Yeah. And, but the Canadian football and being 3 downs, I mean, there's just a different skill set you have to play Canadian football. And you have to be in better, and we've talking with players, you got to be better conditioned. I mean, to play 4-down football is one thing, but to play 3-down football on a larger field where you've got less time between plays, the conditioning is different.
Well, that was something that was interesting with your Kyle Dunnigan episode. Whenever he talked about, sometimes you forget, but even something as simple as throwing an out route on a much wider field, you really had to kind of put a different spin on the ball.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to learn those little things, because us being down here, we don't, and I played football in high school. So I get a lot of it because, even though I wasn't a starter on a high school team, I did, I played every practice, every down in practice. So, so to appreciate what those guys go through to condition and play at that level is just, I went through Army basic training, went through combat training with the Navy. That was easy compared to, in many ways, going through football practice as a kid.
Yeah, I think in some ways it prepared you.
Yeah. In some way, yeah. And for me, I mean, football has always been around, whether or not it's been foremost in my mind. But I'm getting to that point in my life where I can enjoy the sport, and not only as a sport, but as a hobby, to do the podcast, to play simulation football, because I'm at the end of a very long, wrapped up a military career, 30 years, about ready to wrap up a civilian career. So I'm at that next stage of my life where, and moving to Japan, I'll be hopefully I'll be one of the few guys over there writing about the sport. Even though it's right now, it's going to be for my own little blog that doesn't cost anybody a dime. But for me, even though it's a hobby, in my remaining years being over in Japan, that's what I want to do. I want to focus in on, celebrating, American football, even though I'm going to be on the other side of the world.
What's your blog's name?
Well, I've got a couple blogs, but we got CFLamerica.ca, and then we've got GridironJapan.net. So those are the two. And, unfortunately, with work being the way it is, and as you well know, it occupies so much of your time. It's hard to spend the time to post stuff. But once I retire, there'll be a lot more stuff written on both of them.
What was going into this? You had sent me a review that you wrote of a George R. Martin.
Okay, so what I sent you was for my sportsmaster.simulation.games website, and I found it in the public domain, so I did a copy and paste and printed it out of my own website. But it was George R. Martin's short story called The Last Super Bowl, and it was about the demise of real football and the rise of simulation football, much like John Madden football.
Interesting. Like virtual reality in some sense.
Yeah. And if you think about it, we're getting to that point, especially with esports. Science fiction is a lot more to reality than what it was even, say, 10 years ago.
Oh, well, recently I've been looking at virtual reality headsets, and I found a couple companies that actually license their products, or they have partnerships with different NFL teams like the Cowboys or the Bears, and they use those simulation headsets for practice and preparation and reps.
Like the one we see in that commercial with Kyler Murray chucking the ball in the locker room.
Yeah, it's like you see these things at Super Bowls and you think it's just for the fan experience, but they actually use it to simulate real game action.
Right.
And it's interesting to kind of the idea of, I don't know what you call it, just like playing the scenario over in your head. It's like they say, if you envision yourself shooting free throws, well, now it's like you have a much more concrete way to go about it.
Well, I mean, to kind of give an equivalent back, and this is going way back now. We're going to 2020. So we're talking about 15 years ago. So when I went through combat training to go to Iraq, we had virtual simulators, convoy simulators. Technology has improved much since then, because I know when I went into that thing, because of the lag and everything, I ended up falling out because my head started spinning. Mm-hmm. But we've gotten to the point with technology, we can do those things that, we read about, in stories like, that short story by George R. Martin. Virtual reality is becoming ever present. And, e-games, esports, I wouldn't really call esports a sport per se. It's more an activity, much like I would say golf is an activity, not a sport. That's a whole nother argument.
Right.
But we're at that point now where, listen, you don't have to be an athlete to truly enjoy the sport. People that are disabled, that's a great thing about virtual reality and simulation. You've got kids out there, and I was one of those kids too, that really didn't have a whole lot of athletic ability. But you've got kids out there that they're not even able to do the things you and I take for granted, that can now, because of technology, be involved in sports, be a part of it, and get that experience that, back growing up, you had to be physically able to do a lot of things.
Well, even when I wasn't that into football, whenever I was probably from the age of 10 to, 13 or 14, I still really enjoyed playing Madden with my two best friends at the time, who both had played football, and they were both football nuts, and kind of got me to be one eventually. Right. But it was still a fun activity, and in some ways allows you to fall in love with the game even if you don't play it, right? You can just you can enjoy the game for its overall strategy in a way, and just the beauty
Yeah.
of it without having to get bogged down actually playing it with like the fundamentals and stuff like that, which in and of itself can give you a different appreciation for the game, obviously. But I feel like you can enjoy it the way you can enjoy a movie or something.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and the benefit too of, I do that with sim, and I do sim football, which is all PC based and it's all strategy. It's like playing, for lack of a better term, the Star Trek term, it's like playing 3D chess.
Yeah.
And so I play that. I'm in 3 leagues and it's all PC based. But, I know in playing Madden with, say, my nephew's 18, I'd sit there and I'm like, dude, I cannot beat you. His mind, his football knowledge is so much better than mine because of Madden. He grew up on Madden.
Right.
Whereas he's doing all kinds of stuff and he's like, and I'm just there, I'm like, okay, power sweep. Okay, maybe, maybe doing a slant over in the middle. I mean, he's just that much more advanced than I am. Though it is funny, I did beat him a couple times in NCAA football, and he played the controller. I go, no, your uncle beat you, fair and square.
Oh, that's an older game though, so maybe he just didn't know how to like it.
True. But it's those games too, and just talking about it. Hey, I'm going to be 55 years old, but when I sit down and play sim football, when I sit down and play Madden, when I sit down and talk to you podcast wise, when Scott and I do our interviews, hey, it's like we've literally turned back the clock and we're 12 and 13-year-old guys again, or 16-year-old guys enjoying the sport we grew up. It doesn't feel like we're that much older than, than you are. And I know, you're old enough to be my son, so I can say that, but it does. Football allows all of us to kind of, there's a saying in terms of, football allows young people to dream of glory, and it also allows older people to remember what it was like.
Oh, wow. That's a good one. I mean, well, that is interesting because it's like the internet on a broader scale has kind of bridged the gap between a lot of generations, right? I mean, it's like sometimes I would say, if I could live in a time, it would be, or if I could be born in a time, it would be like the late 40s, right? Because it's like you grew up through like the hot rod 50s, and you have the counterculture of the 60s. You kind of go through the grunts of the 70s. You kind of come out of it with your own family in the 80s, and then you have kind of the remnants and see them grow up in the 90s before the internet and the technology age. And then as you get older into this century, you can kind of enjoy all the things about the past through technology. So that's kind of like the interesting part, how everybody has the same exposure now to a lot of different information. And obviously you can have a major case of information overload, but it does kind of put everyone on similar like social patterns in a way.
Yeah, you're right.
And I think it's interesting too, how it's like something like Madden kind of keeps the NFL major, or the NFL in the pop culture conversation, obviously outside of the actual product. And I think that's something where maybe other sports haven't done as well. NBA does pretty good with 2K, but I don't think MLB or hockey can produce a video game that makes it relevant still.
Right. And, talking about video games, I mean, that has always been, we're talking about the Canadian football. It's always been the problem with the Canadian Football League. They don't have a video game. And, I've heard different, and I always get frustrated hearing all the reasons why something can't be done. And in this day and age, I would have thought by now that a league like the Canadian football, a league like the CFL, with basically the financial cliff they're facing, and with them not attracting new fans, would at a point, let's make a video game. Let's get kids interested in the game again. And all I keep hearing is, well, it costs too much. We can't be, this can't. And I'm like, all right. And it's much like, when I was in Iraq, hearing all the reasons why we couldn't do something. And obviously we saw what, Iraq eventually fell apart because there was too many people, at least in my opinion, saying, all the ways you can't do things, where, if some effort went into doing some things, maybe things could have succeeded. Same way with the CFL. If they just put some more effort into marketing, into building that fan base, like through a Madden game that is equivalent in graphics and style and everything, then I think the sport, the league itself, has a chance of surviving, well after I'm gone.
Has there ever been a good CFL movie?
No.
Has there been any at all?
No. No, I heard one's in development, but unless I've missed something, and I'm pretty good at when it comes to movies, and obviously, I'm the one that recommends you go see Gus, and
I can't thank you enough.
and also Paper Lion, which is still my favorite movie, which, like I said, did not have enough Lauren Hutton in it, but that's a whole nother subject. But yeah, no, they don't have a movie. I mean, I know one is supposedly in development with Jake Plummer having a role in it, but I haven't heard anymore.
Oh, okay. When you said Jake Plummer, I thought of the old Cardinals quarterback.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah,
he's supposed to be in it.
He's supposed to be. That's what I heard, but I haven't heard anything in months about where this project is, if it's in developmental hell. So I heard it was going to be on Netflix, but who knows?
Jake the Snake. That's something that used to be really interesting about the NFL too. It feels like they were a lot more proactive about their relationship with Hollywood and working with producers to kind of get the brand. I mean, obviously you have, like Gus and Paper Lion. And
right.
Did you ever see Number One with Charlton Heston?
Yeah, I did actually. After you and Oz did your show, and I think I saw a picture of him, like Charlton Heston in the Saints uniform. But then I watched it. My opinion was, oh man, this was a bad movie.
Why?
It was hard to. I just didn't believe him as a Saints quarterback.
I keep hearing that over and over again, but like when I look at you see the photo, right, of Tom Brady at 40, and then it's like you have Daryl LaMonica at 40, and he's all gray, or actually like 37, he's all gray and scruffy. Like that to me, Charlton Heston, I don't think was a completely unbelievable option.
No, you're right.
To be a 60s quarterback.
Because at that time, you look at pictures of George Bland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, George Bland at age 43 looked like he was 63.
Yeah.
He really did. And I know guys that are, my age now that look 20 years older than me. So, and a lot of things factor in: diet, smoking, the fact that we live in the 21st century, and technology and medicine's all better and everything. But I just had a hard time. I don't know. Stylistically, I mean, it was a great film wise. It looked great on screen. It just didn't connect with me. On that other level of going, oh, this is another, movie I'd want, much like Paper Lion. Paper Lion to me just kind of has it all in terms of football movies. It's got the music, it's got the cinematography. Yeah. Obviously, we've already talked about Lauren Hutton, but at the very end, you got a football game. And you got a football game you don't know the outcome of.
Yeah, well, it's like a perfect hangout movie for football fans, right? I mean, with Number One, you kind of have to follow along with his quick flashbacks and how he became sort of like the gruff character that he is. But with Paper Lion, it's like, you just have such long football sequences, and you have a lot of fun music and kind of good jazz Americana that goes into that time period.
It evoked a time period that I vaguely remember growing up, because it was like towards the end of the 60s. And, I'm of that generation that was born before Sesame Street. And so I kind of remember, I want to call it the era, the Burt Bacharach era. Back then, Burt Bacharach music was kind of popular. And so that's what that whole musical score kind of evokes for me. But again, it just gives me that feeling, hey, I can kind of remember that early 70s, late 60s era.
Were you one of the people that read the book when you were a kid?
Paper Lion?
Yeah.
No. In fact, I read the book just a couple of years ago. And honestly, I was not a fan of it. I read that at the same time I read The Forgettables, and I love The Forgettables.
Oh yeah.
And but Paper Lion, I mean, I enjoyed the movie much more.
Yeah, I see those two books to me, I think, are pretty good early entries into that sort of genre. But I think as more books came later on, like Dr. Z is The Last Season of Willie Eubank and Three Bricks Shy of a Load, like those to me are two of the best you can do in that genre.
And those are ones I have not read yet. In fact, the other day, I downloaded Semi Tough and North Dallas 40. I mean, I've seen the movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And those are other, Semi Tough is one of my favorite football movies, just because I'm a huge Burt Reynolds fan.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. There was also another really good book, I think, that was written early on before the it was actually with the Cowboys, now that I think about it, but I don't remember what the name of the book is. But it's basically about how it follows Dallas when they were still kind of referred to as next year's champion. because they couldn't do
I don't know.
I don't know who the writer was. I don't remember the name of the book, but that was actually a really early one. Now that I think about it, that I still have to get around to reading.
Yeah. Well, it's a thing when it comes to me moving and my next, my wife and I already told her the football books are non-negotiable. All those are going with me.
100%. I haven't gotten rid of any. I've been buying them for the past few years, and I just refuse to get any or to get rid of them.
Well, I'm at the point now, though, I got to go the Kindle route, only just because it's a lot easier to carry with me on the plane.
Nah, man, actually, you'll really like this. I just bought a few books. I mean, this is like the 6-man football book where dreams die hard.
Yeah, I've read that one. It's really good.
Oh, really? Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading this one. And then there's another one about the it's called the Eagles of Heart Mountain, about the Japanese internment camp football team.
Oh, you know what? I did not know about that book.
Oh, dude, yeah, I haven't read it yet, but it does look really interesting, and I would recommend.
Okay.
I shouldn't recommend it if I haven't read it yet, but it does look like an intriguing topic. And then I got these old Pulp Fiction football magazines.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, these were really early in the 40s. They had like these sort of Pulp Fiction magazines centered around just football, and they were obviously like sports ones they had at the time, but similar to how they had like detective novels or westerns they had these guys. But yeah, the artwork on this is awesome. I read another one too. It's this one's from the 50s.
Oh wow.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird, like the story that I read in this one is like sort of like a crime football novel where like those early 30 Hokie college football. Well, this one was actually about a professional player, but about a girl who gets involved with a mobster, and
okay.
And he therefore gets roped into having to throw a game, sort of a deal. But yeah, that was cool, man. I really enjoyed the artwork for the time, and for the people who are wondering what I'm talking about, I'll post a picture of it.
Well, have you found any of these online too? I mean, there's the Internet Library that's got a whole bunch of great stuff. There's a great book on the World Football League. Scott Adamson told me about it, and I did a search one day, and I go, there's only one book, and it's online at the Internet Library. You have to like check it out on an hourly basis. Really? Same way with Howie's book on the Ottawa Rough Riders. I mean, a lot of stuff that's kind of the great thing about the day and age we live in. That a lot of these obscure titles, every now and then it's like the last Super Bowl. Would have never known about it except they stumbled upon it on the internet one day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been a great resource for me finding all of the books and just information in general. I mean, I know we both use newspapers.com, and that's been a real godsend to have to find information and really to find all the books, because you just go down that rabbit hole and find all the vintage ones.
Well, you can, I mean, even, talking about that, just, I'm not plugging SI, but, for me growing up, there was only one place you either got your football news from Sport or from Sports Illustrated, and those were in the library. So that's where, growing up, that's where I got my football stuff. I mean, that was the only source you had, or the newspaper.
Yeah, well, I mean, to the point about like going back to Plimpton, I feel like that's why that book was kind of really popular at the time, because SI was really the only place you could find like breakdowns of games and position by position responsibilities. Right. And because whenever I wrote the book review, it was like, it wasn't really that good because of the stories and the antics and the pranks, but just because of learning about like what a receiver does on a given play, or the vernacular and the terminology.
Yeah. It was in terms of books, it was good. It was an easy read, but then I read the Forgettables, and, I know we're not in we haven't talked about NFL films, and that'll be a discussion for another show. But, having seen the NFL films, 2 documentaries on the Pottstown Firebirds, and then going back and reading the book, I enjoyed it because I could visualize these guys. And it was written very, very well. And, but it's writing, it's books like that. You just, once you find you lose yourself in them.
Yeah. Well, especially, I kind of wish I would have read the book before I watched the 2 documentaries, but whenever I got to talk to Phil talking about the experience of making that.
Right.
I mean,
and in talking about books, I'm right in the middle of, and I'm pulling it up here, on my phone, but I'm reading a book called Gridiron Cup 1982. Okay.
Right, okay.
And it is available if you have Kindle Unlimited.
Mhm.
It's on Kindle Unlimited. It's about international football. Basically, imagine a parallel universe where Joseph Stalin saw American football and decided the Soviets were going to compete with the United States in American football.
I'm interested.
It's really good. I've reached out. We're going to have the author on at some point, hopefully within the next month or two, to talk about the book. But it's a great read. It is. I read it this past. I'm about a quarter of the way in, and I'm hooked.
It's like a speculative fiction book, or it's like okay.
Yeah. I always use the when I read books like that, in order to generate some belief. A lot of times I'll read a book going, oh, that'll never happen. Yes, but in a parallel universe, it might. So I always, I put my DC Comics hat on. I go, well, this is an Earth that we know. This is like Earth 57, where something like this is happening.
Yeah, that's the good part about alternative history. That kind of satisfies the what if.
Yeah.
Well, you have to run very soon, so I'm glad that we had the time to do this, man. This was a lot of fun, very wide-ranging conversation. So
I could talk football all night, man. I love doing this stuff. So, and hopefully we'll be talking hopefully very soon on our other favorite subject, NFL films.
Yeah, everybody stay tuned in the near future. Might be as soon as next week, but more details will come. But yeah, we're going to be doing a entire show revolving around NFL films. So stay tuned, everybody. All right, Greg, do you want to tell people where they can find you on Twitter and Instagram if they've never seen the show?
On Twitter, I'm at CFL America and also at Gridiron Japan. And from there, you can find our websites and our podcast. I know on the podcast side, on CFL America side, you've got CFLAmericaRadio.ca and from the 55yardline.ca. And over on Talking Japanese American Football, you've got Gridiron Japan Radio.net and Gridiron Japan TV.net and then gridironjapan.net. It's a mouthful.
Yeah. I'll put it in the description if anybody didn't get all that. All right, Greg, but thanks again for coming on the show, man. I'm looking forward to the next episode.
All right, brother. We'll see you soon.